Hello and welcome to week 14 of Introduction to Sociology. 14 out of 15 weeks. That means we're at the end of the game here, the last 2 weeks of class. It's pretty exciting. Hope you've had a good Thanksgiving and a little bit of break from at least schoolwork and getting things done and had some fun with family. Today we are going to be looking, or this week, we're going to be looking at population, urbanization, and the environment. And that is chapter 20. So let's go to our course book here. So here we have the title page here and a little bit about demographic changes that are happening in terms of the graying of America. You can read about that. And then we get right into here. Basically, when I do an introduction to psychology class, we sort of look at some major forces of change that occur that provide avenues for our culture to change. And we often talk about population, urbanization, technology, communication, those kind of things. And two of them are right here, urbanization and population, that these forces changed our society from its beginnings as primarily agrarian, farmers and whatnot, people that would do sustenance farming, basically farming for their own food. And then gradually that expanded into an urbanization process coupled with the Industrial Revolution and the technological factors that came in there. And we talked about that right at the beginning of the class. And it sort of bookends on this class. We introduced the idea of these forces of change. And I had that idea of the shoemakers that I have at the beginning of the course book. And now we're here at the end of the class and talking about these major changes and where are we today. And we add of course, issues of environmental issues and climate change. So here we have forces of change. Quickly we're making our way through here. You can read about that, look at population change that have been happening, the different theories about population change and whether or not they're sustainable. It's kind of some interesting reading for you to do right there, reflecting the textbook. The issues of immigration, people coming into our country. This, of course, been a very hot issue with the presidential election that just occurred. And so what is it about immigration? And we really are a country of immigrants. And so the notion of not wanting immigrants is so foreign to America. It's very interesting that we've had that sort of perspective for a while. We are a country of immigrants. The original Americans were Native Americans, and we came in, invaded, decimated that population, and now we're sort of, on the brink of, well, we were under the previous president. We're under the, kind of blaming immigrants for things. We're all immigrants. We're all descended from people who came over in this country, and our doors have been open for quite some time, and certainly that has presented us with some of the most dynamic diversity that we've had in the United States. So we go through some perspectives on immigration there, and then we get into urbanization and the creating of cities. And I would encourage you, I didn't put the link in here, but there's actually a really, really good TV program on New York City by Ken Burns. He's a famous director. And he did a whole series on New York City. It's multiple films on the evolution of that city from its original, pretty much farmland all the way up to the megalopolis that it is today. And it sort of traces this process of urban growth and development. And New York is very unique in that way. It's very much a melting pot. And during the booms in immigration, the port of New York City was the primary entry place for people who were coming from Europe, different from, the port of San Francisco, let's say, that was coming in from the east. And the immigration that was happening on the West Coast, on the East Coast, people were coming into New York City, and they didn't necessarily go very far. They went into town and established their communities there. People from all over the world, and people lived very closely to each other, who in Europe, there were different countries, and it was quite a social experiment when you think about New York City being so diverse. in that process, however, we see some problems in terms of the development of cities. We see these studies, the first wave study, the second wave study, and the issue of redlining. And redlining is a historical reality that has occurred in a lot of cities, still has an impact, and that's when banks looked at particular areas of the city primarily dominated by immigrants and people of color, and basically drew red lines around them and said that they would be less favorable for providing loans to businesses or entrepreneurs in that area. And the ultimate impact of that has been in the degradation of those particular areas. Then the strategy being that those individuals would gradually move out. It'd be, squatting apartments and stuff, but people would just move out. And then the property values would be really low. And then developers could come in, white developers come in, buy up the property, destroy everything that's there, build beautiful apartment buildings that nobody who used to live there can afford. And that process is called gentrification, where the people that were in those places could no longer afford to live there unless they're in rent-controlled places, which still exist in New York City. Rent-controlled apartments, unless they have that kind of benefit. You can have, I actually know someone who lives in an apartment, probably pays about $800 a month for an apartment in New York City. The apartment across the way on the next building is over $1 million. And so, same apartment, but because of rent controls. But if they didn't have that rent control, these people would be out of that area. So you get this process that's happened in the urban centers all over the United States of redlining, property values go down, discrimination, essentially against people of color and immigrants. And those areas have become very troubled, economically depressed. People move out, they get bought up, cleared out, and then very expensive apartment buildings and whatnot, and businesses go in. It's under the guise of sort of urban development, but there's a loser in that, and that's the original people that were living there and the process by which all that happened. So we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about those kinds of factors in this week's discussion. Now we keep on moving through our content here, and there's the stuff on gentrification. Then I get into some urban space development, and this is something that actually we can experience locally. It's part of that gentrification. Admittedly, there's some areas, let's say, that the city takes over and they try to make it beautiful. But I'm really sort of emphasizing the places that are open to the public and parks and whatnot. And I give some examples of businesses that have created spaces where people gather, and almost the secondary part is purchasing things, and so we have companies like Starbucks, where Starbucks are just cool places to be. You can go there, you don't have to buy anything. There's internet access, and you can just hang out, and those places become hangouts. And even Apple has created some of their spaces, some of their stores, to be places that you would actually visit. I didn't get to do it, but the last time I was in New York City, I really wanted to go to Fifth Avenue, where Apple has its famous big glass square, one of their first major Apple stores. And so Apple is creating these places where people will visit, and they can just casually, there's no pressure sales, just casually encounter their products and whatnot in beautiful spaces and whatnot. It's an interesting method of sales. So I put some examples, some pictures in the course book here. If you're looking at the version of the course book, not the PDF, but the EPUB version, you'll be able to actually have this feature over here. But this picture right here, there's more than one picture there if you press on these little dots. So here's the Apple store in Lincoln Park, Chicago. This is an Apple store in the Louvre, which is the famous museum in Paris. If you saw the Da Vinci Code, you saw these. This was a feature that was in that movie. The inverted triangle and the inverted pyramid. And there's the Apple store right there, next to one of the most famous and iconic pieces of art in the world. Next, we have the famous Big Cube. This is on Fifth Avenue in New York City. The store is actually underground. So these become actually tourist attractions built to beautify these parts of the city. And then here we have at the Opera House in Paris. You see that. And then finally at Covent Garden in London. Very, very famous places in which Apple has put these stores in. Very expensive properties. The last part of this chapter, we go into climate change and really kind of looking at how we use land, water security, and of course, global warming or climate change, or the reality of that. We're really, really beyond the controversy anymore. People talk about, how much of it is human created, how much is the natural evolution of the planet. And, most, like not even most, almost the entire majority of the world of science has said that human beings are having an impact. And in a way, it really doesn't matter. We have to do something about it anyway. The planet's warming up. And so it's having effects and just being aware of those things. So here's, some thoughts about that I put into the last part of our course book. Then we get into the area of our assignments. And the first assignment is the discussion. And that is, as I said, talking about redlining, gentrification, and those kind of things. Doing some research on that. Go look out there. Just look that up. Redlining and pick a city. Redlining in Chicago. Redlining in Miami. Just like that. And just report out on that and see, kind of what's going on. And realize that these things happened a long time ago. A couple generations ago. So part of what we're seeing in terms of the Black Lives Matter is a carryover of these injustices from decades ago, and not justifying violence and discussion, but certainly justifying the anger and frustration. This kind of discrimination has been going on a long time, and those of us who are not subject to that are relatively blind to that. That's part of what we mean by white privilege, is that it didn't affect me. I didn't have to think about that. It's never been part of my history. I've never had a relative who had to move out of their place because they could no longer afford the taxes because the place had been gentrified. So that is not something that has happened to many white people. So it has people who are white living there, but primarily a person of color issue, being respectful of that experience. The next is an assignment, a written document with the title page and all that stuff uploaded, where what I want you to do is to look in, what we have is urban areas here in the main area. And these are areas that have been developed for public use, like the walking trail in Augusta that goes all the way to Gardner. And then you have the waterfront space that's in Waterville, actually right behind the Opera House. There's a big space down there that they developed, winding paths and, beautiful art and whatnot. And I'm sure up in Bangor and in Lewiston, Auburn, and Portland, of course, has the beautiful areas downtown, but they also have the park and some, even one of the businesses there is there's a big farmer's market that's there. I think it's still there, but go visit one of those places and see if you can get some of the history about that. And, what was it before that? Part of the beautification part, it can be a gentrification part, but it's certainly one of those places that brings people together and creates the community that we have in city life. So I'm asking you to write a paper about that, where you're looking at the space and especially looking at the history, and be fully okay with going to your town office, going to the city office or whatever, and saying, hey, what's the history of this? Are there some records I can look at, or go to the local library asking for that, and get to know that space. That Waterville is really kind of, because of the involvement of Colby College downtown, they're actually in the process now, beginning the process of developing some interesting public spaces down there. So that's a really, really good city to work on there. Either the town office or the local library should have information on the history of that space. And so you can write a paper about that, just that local experience of that process. So that's what we're going to be talking about this week. We have 2 weeks left. The other thing that is due this week, of course, is your research paper or your service learning paper. As you're reading this, it's Monday, and I'm going to be using Monday and Tuesday to get your drafts. For a few of you have submitted drafts. I really appreciate that. I'm going to make my way through those Monday and Tuesday and get those back to you, and I apologize. I should have done that over the break. And get those quickly back to you so you can do your rewrites ready for submission at the end of this week. If you are doing a service learning, then your paperwork has to be in next week. But put it in as soon as you got it, and just send that my way. And make sure you fill out that survey. I'll be going over that a little bit next week. So have a great week. Welcome back to school, and make these last 2 weeks strong. I'll see you later.